Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets talk about veteran issues, science, engineering, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guess, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Doing great, Pearson. Good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you too. So today is episode 21. We're going to be continuing with our globalization series. This will be Globalization Part 4. And this one's going to be a fun one. We'll be talking about the true beginning of the Cold War, 1917, and the collapse of the Russian Empire. But first, instead of our good news story, I have a little bit of housekeeping, probably some house cleaning that needs to be done with the two toddlers. But yeah, for our housekeeping, I want to apologize first to the Spotify listeners. I'm about 3 episodes behind. I think episode 18, 19, and 20 need to be uploaded. So I will get to that very soon, and I apologize for that. And then episode 20 was supposed to release today. I had miscommunications with my editor, and that will be hopefully releasing tomorrow. So, yeah, he was on vacation, and I didn't know. I knew I had to edit one. I didn't know I had to edit two, and that was my bad. So, anyways, now that that's out of the way, let's get right into it. Richard, you want to go ahead and recap last episode? Give us a quick TLDR.
All right, so we are at the point in history where World War I is kicked off. You have Central Powers fighting the Entente. The Entente is made up of an alliance between France, Russia, and Great Britain. And there's your primary players, and the Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary.
Romania.
I feel like Romania was in there somewhere, and of course we have the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire, and later kind of the Italians, but they were unreliable for this one. But yeah. And then there was a bunch of others. There was a whole bunch of other African countries were involved. People took sides on here too. So we're always missing all of these other countries. I'm sorry for missing out, but everyone was fighting. There was fights in Africa. There was fights. People were being drawn from India.
This was a global war.
It was a global war.
And the Western Front gets all the fame and notoriety because of its. The first time I ever heard the word charnel house was in reference to the front, and that human life and treasure were being ground into a paste every day.
Yes.
So what we're choosing to do with this series is not to really, pun intended, get bogged down in the trenches of the Western Front, but to talk about the global situation of what was going on.
Yeah,
curiously there was major foundational historic events happening simultaneously with the combat going on the Western Front, and we kind of missed their importance at the time. But we're going to talk about that today. You have something to say?
Yeah, really. So while all this was happening, and even leading up to World War I, far before it, I would say that there was a serious momentum and discontent happening due to the rise of liberalism. Yeah. And between last episode and this episode, I kind of had to go back because, like you said, we had focused on World War I. And for me to fully understand what your perspective was going to be about the Cold War starting in 1917, I kind of had to, well, first I visited Stalin, per your recommendation, and then started to listen to a couple other dictators. I got through Stalin and Mao. But naturally, after Stalin, I had to look into Lenin more. And then looking into Lenin, I had to look into Marx. It was almost necessary. And it's funny how this works, but when you look into Marx, you almost have to revisit Haig, Marx is basically his protege. And if you really want to understand a fundamental ideological chain, Haig was a huge fan of Aristotle. Now, I don't want to go on a full tangent on here, but Aristotle, I think, was a very misguided philosopher in his perspective and his interpretation of the world in many ways. Now, I'm not saying all of his ideologies or all of his philosophies. Ideology is funny saying his ideologies when Plato is the one who literally invented the idea of ideology. So, and they were peers. but they were often Plato was his teacher at first, I believe, kind of as like but then they were essentially colleagues who disagreed about essentially everything, and I could see why. As someone who agrees more with Plato necessarily on some of his philosophical principles, but this is just to give you an idea of where these philosophies derived, because it's really important to understand what was happening and why this was happening. At the time, capitalism was churning through the proletariat or the factory
Yep.
worker.
Yep.
And it was causing, in Germany specifically, it was grinding through people, which Marx witnessed that. And then he witnessed more of that in the UK, which at the time, England really had a terrible industrial factory setting. Kids were, the average lifespan was very short. And so he saw these terrible conditions and made a bunch of predictions about the evil of capital and where it was going to go.
Yeah.
Um, and he was a revolutionary. I think some people look at Marxism as though it's a softer version of communism, and it really isn't. It doesn't use as harsh language, but Marx and his cohort, he wrote a lot of about the Communist Manifesto and Marxism with another philosopher at the time as well. I forget his name. Um, but they were revolutionaries, and they wrote revolutionary script and propaganda, and they wrote revolutionary documents. Um, the reason this is important is because I think proto globalization went through this entire maturation process up into in the during the 1800s, and this was happening throughout Europe and Russia to a lesser extent, but also in the U.S. And so liberalism and capitalism were on the rise in a pretty terrible way for a lot of the average workers at first. But as it matured into the 1900s, people were seeing profit. People were becoming unburdened from the strictures of working the factory lifestyle. People were becoming better off. And anyways, there's a lot to say that we saw this breakdown within the factory setting, but a lot of people took a hold of this idea and ran with it. And Lenin was a huge person to follow Marx's teachings. He studied Marx through and through, and he made adjustments to Marx's ideology as well. He added more harshness to, I would say, Marx's ideology. But Lenin is a super important figure to understand. So we kind of need to know where these ideologies came from, I believe. It's important to set a contextual setting. So
You're thinking of Friedrich Engels.
Engels, yes, that's
Yep.
it. And we'll talk
Engels and
about
Marx.
Bernstein as well, because I would like to talk about social democracy, because it's extremely misunderstood in our modern
Yep.
parlance, and it probably should have been called social capitalism or
Yeah.
social liberalism, actually. In hindsight or retrospective, it should be rebranded as that. But this is important. This will be important down the line. Social democracy and Bernstein's refutation of Marx, essentially. Anyways,
So what I'm hearing you saying is that in the empire system, where you have autocratic or monarchical empires, that their approach at organizing a civilization had pretty profound negative consequences on the working class people that processed raw materials into finished goods, that transported finished goods to wherever they're going to be sold. And anyone involved in the early stages of commodities to products ended up having kind of a bad lot. You're saying in the 19th century.
yeah, it was more a matter of timing, because the
Mm-hmm.
factory engine was really was revving up through the 1800s to a level
Yeah.
we had never seen. The industrialization was happening, and this was due to global commerce really expanding so much over the 1800s. The discovery of coal and then
Mm-hmm.
oil, all of these things
Mm-hmm.
happened during the really took off during the 1800s. And so in the 1850s, what I was describing and what you've reflected was what it was. but liberalism and the power of monarchies was really fading over the 1800s.
Yeah.
So we were seeing the vestiges of imperial top-down kind of harsh uh, control of the people, but they were decade after decade getting parliaments. They were getting freedoms. They were getting, and many were becoming rich. Merchants by the 20th century, 1900s,
Yeah.
were wealthy. There was lots of people who had gotten out of poverty, generational classes who had worked their way out of poverty. So it was happening, but we were also seeing the transition of empires. Like you said, these empires changed from monarchies to more, they would have parliaments. Even, in Russia, what we're going to talk about, they had the Duma, they started
Hmm.
their own parliament under the Tsar as well.
Yeah.
So we were seeing this everywhere. And so it was this weird transition time where Marx saw the pain and suffering, but he had kind of dug in on his ideology and didn't get to see the maturation, or maybe he did, but just didn't recognize it. And Marx and what's the other one's name again? One more time.
Friedrich Engels.
Engels. They also, there's been a lot of issues with the evidence that they put forth when they were writing their Communist Manifesto and Marxism. They cherry picked a lot of data to kind of use it to paint a narrative, obviously, and also to
Right.
write propaganda. Um, and some of Bergstein's biggest complaints were, you guys are using tons of wrong data. This data doesn't work. You're cherry picking data to kind of support your claim. And it's painting a
Mhm.
picture that isn't really based in reality. And it could be like at certain factories, absolutely, there was harsh conditions and stuff, but it wasn't a blanket wide statement, and it couldn't be generalized across all of Europe. But Marx and Engels truly believed that all of Europe was a powder keg. I mean, and
Yeah.
Lenin and Stalin, all of these guys had a long history of believing um, that liberalism had failed and that the people were suffering because of it. And it was generally the biggest evil out there was capital. They really did think it was an evil system, wrongfully so, as you and I will prove out through our series, I think, over time. So, but
So
yes,
what?
that's the situation.
Yeah, and this is the financial structure and the global trade structure. Um, One of the things that we're going to contrast with with this series that we're doing is that in the post World War II world order, trade is free between countries. In this world order, trade is not free between countries. Trade is not free between empires or nations because of the way that if you advantage another nation in any way, then you're just as likely to be attacked by them in the future. So there's all these different players in the European um, uh, cultural system, economic system that are kind of islands into themselves. They form coalitions with other nations. Trade happens between them, but generally speaking, it's very tentative, and it's as I've said in the past, our mindset is with a shrinking pie in many cases. We can't imagine a world where the pie just gets bigger because we keep growing more wealth. No, everything is a zero sum game. If I trade with someone else, I've lost that and they've gained it.
And what
So,
capital was doing for the first time is it was
mhm,
showing, it was allowing for, it was a system that allowed for countries or empires to
mhm,
gain and amass wealth that was outside the old continental empire um, structure or system, that
right.
the one that we've discussed multiple times now over the globalization series. That was the big difference, is that capital allowed for, and this was starting to happen. This was in the 1800s. This was happening, and then we had the World War One breakout, where we saw a breakdown. So it wasn't
Mhm,
free. It was rather expensive for the proto globalization. I would say the second time, World War II, after that, when we globalized again, it was a lot cheaper because the U.S. was leveraging its own navy to
mhm,
basically make it safe to trade. around the world stage. And then I think we had the rise of naval shipping insurance to the system that is now breaking down as we speak. Naval
Yeah.
insurance is breaking down as we speak. So we had the rise of naval insurance, which was also another layer of security for most routes. But we'll get to why this is breaking down as well. But yes, that's the situation. Global trade was not free. It was very expensive and very dangerous. But it was happening until World
Yeah.
War One, in which then things broke down again. Yeah.
So, in the person of Vladimir Lenin, um, first of all, let's just we'll go with the idea that Vladimir Lenin is a pen name. That's not his original name. He wasn't given that name at birth, and he was born to a family that had achieved some social mobility in the former Russia in the former Russia Empire. So, it's a lot of fun to think about these revolutionaries coming from poverty and then gaining and attaining incredible power and meteoric rise. No, he was essentially what Russia had for a middle class, and had the wherewithal to go to college and to, you know, um, have some exceptions made for him to get his grades and everything. And this is a person that I just want to clarify that um,
He didn't have Stalin's start. By
Stalin's chart is way more rugged for
Yeah, when you
sure.
were describing the poor come from nothing, I was like, oh,
Yeah,
Stalin's Georgian ass,
yeah,
definitely. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, Lenin, he was an educated man. He was
yeah,
university educated. I
totally.
mean, this was the stark difference in why Stalin was looked down upon was,
Hmm.
and Stalin was rather educated for a poor person as well,
Right.
because he had got his education through the church. But Lenin and Trotsky, they
Yeah,
always looked at him
yeah,
like he was a villain, like he was a dumb, like a villain, not a villain, like he just didn't have that level of intelligence, and they would say he didn't have that sophistication. They knew he was smart, but they thought he was dumb compared to them, and they did look down at him like that. Stalin knew that too because he was very smart. So
we're setting the stage for real viper's nest of a civil order slash disorder coming into play here.
well, we're talking about Russia, so it's been a viper's nest
Totally.
for you know the last century at least, probably forever.
All right. So Vladimir Lenin, pen name, uh, comes from a middle class family, has some siblings, and I'm not I'm not at all interested in doing the step by step biography here. I don't think that you and I have the focus for that kind of biography. One and two, we're trying to get to this inflection point pretty quickly.
I will
What
say he was a man that was determined to change Russia.
really
I
was
think we can
very
sum it up
determined.
as that. He was ousted a couple times from Russia by his
Hmm.
own choice or ran out, for whatever reason. And he was brought back a couple times during these revolutionary periods, which we discussed 1905, um, where the Duma, I believe we discussed it, right? The Duma was created as a concession by the
Yeah.
czars. This was Alexander the Second before he was killed. Um, uh, and then Nicholas the Tsar took over after that. But the second, but yeah, so there was concessions being made. Lenin was ousted by 2000, by 1907 or something like that. Had to go to Finland, and then he was hanging out in Austria, I believe, after that, right?
Let's not forget that he's spent some time both in jail and in exile in Siberia.
He did get sent to Siberia as well. Okay,
Hmm.
that's right. I forgot about that. I always think
And
Stalin went twice, so then I'm remembering that.
yeah,
But yeah,
what and we're referring to the names of people in history that oftentimes are conflated or confused. Until very late in life, I had imagined that Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin were contemporaries and formed the Soviet Union. So I was confused for the longest time on all of this.
yeah. I didn't know Marx was German for a while. I think when I got an issue of Capital, the book, which is huge. Then I realized I was like, oh shit, he's German. I thought he was Russian because of communism was so prevalent there. Lenin. I
Yeah,
thought they were tied. I thought the same thing. I thought they were cohorts. I thought they lived at they had talked and discussed each other. I thought they were colleagues.
yeah.
For the love of God, yeah. I mean,
No, they weren't. They were separated by several decades in age,
yep.
and whereas Engels and Marx had come up with the Communist Manifesto and written Das Kapital and had, you know, a, attempted to outline a possible world order that would be better for working people. Um, they weren't in a position to put any of these ideas into action. In the person of Vladimir Lenin, we have someone who is a troublemaker from the perspective of the Tsar's um, polity. Like, he gets in trouble with the secret police a couple times, but what really radicalizes him um, the death of his brother. So his brother had been involved in a assassination plot. They caught him and they executed him.
Hmm.
And in the way that oftentimes these revolutionary figures of history go from their so-called humble beginnings to being a revolutionary, this was what radicalized Vladimir Lenin. He had already been writing on the topic of communism. He'd already been writing on the topic of establishing a workers' paradise. He'd already had these ideas. He already was collaborating with people to come up with a way to do this in Russia. But really, the thing that set him down the path that made him the senior political figure in the new Soviet Republic of Russia,
Yeah.
was this execution of his brother. So Vladimir Lenin, we've described as having been born in Russia, but then being exiled to Siberia, but then coming back, and then he and his wife are now kind of peripatetic. They end up in Germany. They end up in England. They settle for a while in Switzerland, and they're in Switzerland during the beginning of World War One.
Yes.
So one of the
Lenin
really
is there, and Stalin, another figure that will be coming up very soon, is in
Mhm.
Siberia during World War
Mhm.
One. So
Mhm.
both of them are in exile. Both of the major players of the communist future are exiled while World War One is happening for
Yep.
essentially the same thing. I mean, Stalin had been distributing pamphlets. By then, Lenin and Stalin knew each other,
Yeah.
and Lenin loved Stalin um, because he loved that he was Georgian. If anybody doesn't know this, Stalin was Georgian. He was not Russian. Stalin's not even his name. He's changed his name a bunch of times. So these are some cool little things that I didn't know about Stalin, but it totally makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
Russia really invented modern spycraft. I mean, these guys have been spying for it's in the makeup of their culture or something. But yeah, so they were revolutionaries. Stalin was having fun. He was having a blast being a revolutionary at the time, it sounded like. And, probably Lenin was too. They were living that subversive lifestyle, spycraft, trying to overthrow the government. It was a sexy gig, probably until Lenin's brother died. You're right, and then shit got serious. And same for Stalin when his wife died. It was like, not that she was killed by, the czar or anything. So,
Stalin was a brigand and was raising was I could say he was raising money for this cause, but I mean, whatever his motivations were, he was with people kicking over banks. He was committing robberies and crimes to
yeah,
get a war chest going.
yep,
And this is like this is when you think about the kleptocratic modern state of Russia and the way that it has people with secret service ties at the head of the state, and you've got these um, oligarchs that are more or less in charge of divvying up the resources of the nation.
it's just a
Well,
mob. It's a mob. It's ran like a mob. Putin is a mob
yeah,
boss, and the oligarchs. It is, and the dons decide who the leader is anyways. The oligarchs decided Putin would be the one to
Hmm.
secure their wealth. Putin was invented by them. His image was invented by them. Everything was crafted down to public events, similar to Reagan. I mean, it's unironic. There's a really famous moment where something about a pen. I've watched a video of Putin where you know, uh, what is it? He like has to take the pen back or gives it back or something. It's some power move that looked really cool. It was all staged though. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, they do. What they were doing was signing a new labor contract, and one of the people involved in the dispute had to sign on the contract. He picked up Putin either gave him the pen or picked up Putin's pen, signed, and like you do, began to walk off with the pen.
Yeah,
And and Putin says, hey, that's my pen. Bring that back." And you're describing something that everyone who sees this understands what happened there was a classic, you know, um, a classic thing where you do something that's really important. It's very distracting, and you just walk off with the pen that was in your hand because now your brain is elsewhere.
yeah.
And what you're describing is no, that was contrived in such a way to really manufacture the image of this guy.
The image of authority, the image
Yeah,
of look at him just command like wait, nothing is missed. Look at his attention
yeah,
to detail, and
yeah,
and so everything about Putin has been manufactured because Putin. Most brilliant thing about him is his psychology. He understands
yeah,
psychology. He is a
yeah.
psychologist. Putin is a terrible war commander, obviously, but well, I'm sorry. He's a
The
terrible
numbers are in.
physical war commander. As far as his psyops command and their ability to inflict harm upon our country right now over the last 15
Hmm.
years is more impressive than what Stalin was a brilliant psychologist. When it came down to the psychology of
Hmm.
power and evil, Stalin
Hmm.
understood this. Mao understood this. There's a through line for these men in understanding how to obtain power and how to keep power. Lenin was very
Yeah.
simple. Lenin understood this. Lenin understood that revolution not only was necessary, but violent revolution was required and needed. And he was excited for violence and revolution. So was Stalin.
And if I think if I'm conflating my histories here, maybe you can correct me. But the concept that comes from Engels and Marx's work had to do with a proletariat rising out of the working class. No, the proletariat rising into a bourgeoisie class, and then creating the foundation for this revolution and changing the governing structure that way. And what we're seeing is, oh no, you don't have to do any of that at all. You just have to knock a thing over when it's the most distressed in the middle of a global war,
Yes.
and you can take it over that way. So
Yeah,
this is what
Lenin
happened.
wanted Russia to lose. Lenin was watching and waiting for Russia to lose. The Germans sent him back. And then,
Exactly.
because they were like, yeah, that seems like a good idea. It comes back to bite them in the ass
Yeah.
for a little bit, but anyways, yeah. So this is Lenin's mentality. He didn't coordinate the overthrow. So it's important to understand that Lenin represented one party of Marxists, essentially, and there was another party of Marxists. There was two parties. There was the Bolsheviks, and then the
Mensheviks.
Mensheviks. And
Yep.
interestingly, the Mensheviks also had the heir to the throne when Nicholas II was running in 2017. I believe the Ice Palace is being overtaken. Oh no, this hasn't happened yet. Nicholas the Tsar first, the second said to Alexander, I believe, was some other family member. He basically was
Hmm.
like, "Hey, you can have the czarship, like you get it." And Alexander was a Mitch. He was a God, say it again.
Menshevik.
A Menshevik.
Menshevik.
Yeah, he was a Menshevik, and he was like, no, we need to put this to a vote. And it like blew Nicholas Tsar's mind. So at first, when the first revolution happened, and this was due to Nicholas the Tsar the second getting, deciding he should take over the Russian army, which led
Hmm.
to him squarely putting all the blame on his own crown,
Yep.
which led to the revolution, which led to the Mensheviks taking over first, not the Bolsheviks. They didn't get
Hmm.
the area first. But and so yeah, that's kind of the stage of which when Lenin comes back and has to start rallying Bolsheviks into the Duma to gain more parliamentary seats to kind of overthrow the Mensheviks at the time. And the
Yeah.
Mensheviks weren't doing a good job of kind of governing at this period of time during the transition. Um,
So the German Empire knew that Vladimir Lenin, if he was back in Russia, with the way that things were going apace in Russia, that that it was weak enough that if he was around fomenting trouble, it would be him being in the country would destabilize it enough that it would not be able to fight. It would not be able to bring a mobilized army to the front and actually fight.
yes.
And so throughout this happens in early 1917,
Yep.
and if you're interested enough from our confused back and forth about this, if
Yeah.
you dig into the history of the Russian Revolution in 1917, you can tell that there are it's fits and starts. It doesn't it, there's things that seem to happen and then peter out, and then they happen again and they peter out, and
Yep.
maybe we rally the troops and we go back to the front, and then the troops are no, and then there's a revolts against the commissioned officers by the enlisted persons, and
Yeah, you had the
they murder them.
the
Right?
Soviets before it was
Yeah.
Union. The Soviets were just
Yeah.
the army bloc of the Russian
Yes.
parliament that had basically formed, and so, but they were not interfering when the Bolsheviks basically revolted against the Mensheviks. The army just kind of was like, well, because I think Lenin had subverted enough of them
Yeah.
to be Bolsheviks. I think Trotsky had a lot to do with this too, as well. It seemed he was because Trotsky was, a brilliant, by Russian standards, a brilliant military general. He was the only, one of the few guys who had won battles in World War One. Trotsky, if I'm remembering correctly. So he was actually kind of like he was super respected, educated, Jewish. Which might have explained a lot of Stalin's future hatred towards the Jews. Although I would
Yeah.
say the Slavs, everyone had excuses to hate the Jews. Of course, this is a
Yeah.
common throughput through history. So I won't say that that might have been his specific reason, but I'd say Trotsky probably represented why Stalin could easily project all of his hatred onto the Jewish population based on that one thing. I would like to mention also that something
Hmm.
that's interesting about these dictators, and maybe it's just the communist dictators specifically, but um, Putin has this as well. These dictators really enjoyed having a villain,
Yes.
and Putin has does this too. He doesn't kill the villain right away. In fact, sometimes it's
Yeah.
useful to have the villain.
Yeah.
And like Putin's current villain was he's kind of a fundraiser for those Legion Russian armies that are fighting in Kursk and Belgorod right now. He just
Hmm.
recently did an interview. I sent it to you, but he was the only person in the Duma who voted no on the annexation of Crimea before they invaded in 2014,
Yep.
and Putin. Uh, and when that guy, it's a really interesting story that we'll just have to talk about later. But the point is that these dictators really like to have a villain. It was something about keeping a villain around. They were a useful weapon for them, or sometimes it was hard for them to dispatch the villain. But either way, villains are really important in the story of dictators, and it's something that I found fascinating. Trotsky was Stalin's villain, but Trotsky was very high up in Lenin's um, hierarchy of leadership because Trotsky was an educated, college educated man, and so he was one of the ones who did look down on Stalin as well. So I thought that was really interesting. But the idea of villains is a through line here.
So it turns out if you have an arch nemesis, if you keep that arch nemesis alive, then you can justify any amount of force or violence in the act of pursuing them. And so if you have this arch nemesis, you can just sort of keep them dangling out there as a bright shiny object to distract everyone with, while you actually carry out the executions and eliminations of everybody else who's annoying,
Yeah.
or otherwise would make a more competent nemesis. But you keep that one out there. Yeah, exactly. You really caught on to one of the greatest unseen features of an autocratic empire or an autocratic fascist regime, where it's all about the psyop of the entire game, both against the people that are within the country and the people that are outside of it. And this
And
is
people
done
within
very
your own government as well, too. It's
totally.
yeah. There's a bunch of different psychological elements. It's really hard being, and I think because we're raised in a Western culture, and under the oldest democracy on the planet
Yeah.
as well. People say we're in a young country, but I always like to mention that we're an old democracy. We are an old
Hmm.
democracy. So we're very mature at that. So our freedoms feel a little mature as far as that goes. And I think studying this deep dive into Russian and Chinese communist China and the cultures that surrounded them has really been interesting, because I've had to change my thinking style, because it's a different logic. Actually, it's a different reasoning. And you'll find that these dictators were very logical, like
Yeah.
beyond any heart or soul, really. I mean, a lot of what they did, you're like, well, now I understand why they did it. I mean, it doesn't make it any less horrible, but it
Yeah.
actually makes you understand why they were doing the actions. Why Mao Zedong, under 40 years of rule, I think had 7 revolutions that he led in his own country to maintain power. And we will get eventually to one of his great villains. I don't know if you've heard his story, but he spends 10 years orchestrating a revolution against his entire government because of, this one guy. I mean, it's not this one guy, but we'll get to China eventually. It's fascinating, though. Um,
As a corollary to these behaviors that from the outside seem confusing and irrational, as a corollary, one of the other interesting things about revolution is that the people whose mindset makes them good at being revolutionaries is not compatible with a mindset at being good at governance. And so
I'm very happy you brought this up, because I have, you're like me reading my thought, but go ahead. Yes.
so what's interesting sometimes is that in the process of prosecuting a revolution, whoever the figurehead is that ultimately ends up being the dictator that takes over, the autocrat that takes over, they sometimes are, I mean, there's got to be exceptions, but enough of the time it's a clear pattern. They have to execute some of their revolutionaries once the takeover is finished.
Oh,
Because one,
yeah.
the revolutionaries are really only good at revolution. They're not good at governance. And so they will keep pursuing the revolution and point it now at the new autocrat that they installed. So one. And then two, sometimes that's the best way to convince the population that you're on their side, by getting rid of these guys that fomented the revolution.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, it's all about using, it reminds me of the newer Republicans, the newer, the Matt Gaetz
Mm-hmm.
and Marjorie
Mm-hmm.
Taylor Greens, when they were blocking Republican bills, this last couple years.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, and I know me and my wife like to just joke about this all the time. It's like, well, this is all you taught them to do, is just block things. So now they're like, are
Yeah.
you mad at me, Dad? I'm blocking your bills now. It's all they know is
Yep.
blocking. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's a certain class where that's all they know is revolution. To add to that, to yes and it, I was talking to Sarah about this, is communism, it's written into the manifesto. Revolution is part of it through
Yes.
action,
Yes.
this is really important, through action. Marx and Engels were very important to talk about the action of revolution and then the soul and spirit of revolution. These were huge ideas, tying your spirit to, and fascism really built off this, by the way. So a couple things I really wanted to talk about that you've kind of opened up for with that comment is, if it was communism was like a perfect manifesto for how to consolidate power. Which
Nailed
is
it.
not, I don't know if that's necessarily what Marx had intended, but what it really was it was a roadmap for how a outside party can integrate in and consolidate power to the state, absolute consolidation, unlike, anything we had seen, like reconsolidating power into an authoritarian, totalitarian state,
Hmm.
and it had no way to how to govern it. The communism really didn't show you how to actually govern the state that you had consolidated. And so what you would have is this situation where these leaders who had followed the manifesto, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, they were brilliant at consolidating power. They knew people, they understood psychology, they knew what to say to maintain power, but they couldn't govern their goddamn country. And so they would have to, but they would have to
Yep.
fall back on the revolution portion of the Communist Manifesto. And instead of
Yep.
going, well, hey, the communist shit isn't working anymore, but the revolution kept working, and they would use that as a means to remain in power for whoever they needed to overthrow within their own
Hmm.
government, who was starting to, pay attention to some of their failed plans when, people were starting to eat each other in their own countries. This happened in the largest communist parties, by the way. Both Mao and Stalin oversaw countries where many, many people ate each other,
Yeah.
boiled each other's bodies for lye and for fertilizer.
Hmm.
We Communism dehumanized humans more than anything had done in a long time.
Yeah.
Probably more than even slavery in the U.S. did. Communism made conditions that where people were eating each other, where people distrusted you so much that you could be a meal for another farmer. This happened in Russia. This happened in Ukraine when the oppression of Ukraine by Stalin, by the way, the Ukrainians, and we'll get into this. And so when we're talking about how brilliant these guys are, make no mistake, they are some of the most evil men in history, and
Yes.
really evil, truly evil. Stalin signed 180,000 different papers with lists of names on it for people to be executed. He signed
Yes.
all 180,000 of these documents, and through it, he would make notes on each of the on people's names, like traitor or whatever, blah blah blah, and they or he would laugh sometimes and he would say, "Oh, don't kill this person. Give him 25 years in Siberia." And it would he got off on signing those documents, the death
Yep.
lists, the ones that send people to the gulag and all the places you heard about. Like, Stalin got off on this. He enjoyed sending people to their death, to the misery. One of the biggest things with communism, which is about the ideology that you need to understand that it instilled in the true believers, was everything is for the greater good. That's the justification that they could
Yeah.
always fall back on, is no amount of death matters if it's for the greater good. And the greater good is whatever was in the autocrat's head, really. And this Mao thought the same thing. He famously said, hey, if 50% of my population dies, like sometimes you have to kill 300 million people. That's what he thought. And he put
Yeah.
his best effort in. If we look at the numbers retroactively, I mean, it's like 80 to 120 million people is Mao Zedong is responsible for. And ultimately the collapse of China now that will happen, Mao is also responsible for. I mean, his follow-on government for keeping that one-child policy is also responsible for that. But I digress.
One of the one of the things that was lurking kind of in what you were saying is it was really baked into Vladimir Lenin's processes and policies and his how he carried out his work, which was you could agree with him on 99% of what they were doing, but that 1% was enough to get you booted. It was enough to get you expelled or executed, or whichever punishment that needed to be dealt to you for not agreeing on 100%, literally to the T. So not just the concepts, not just the spirit, but the actual steps of execution to do the job. You had to concur with him 100%. And so it
Totalitarianism, indeed.
yeah, and you can see how that would create these interesting divisions within the revolution. This is how you get these interesting um, dramas that are carried out between two revolutionary groups that are just they're partisans with the same conceptual designs,
Different
but the
execution
way
styles.
yep the how they carry out these designs is totally different because of the person of Vladimir Lenin. You have brought up Joseph Stalin quite a bit in this conversation, where Lenin was our subject, and I think that that's appropriate because in the hearts and minds of the American, uh, I should say this instead, in the cultural memory of America, is more the person of Joseph Stalin, and that's because of the role that he played in that 40 some years, yeah,
Yeah,
thereabouts,
40
almost
years,
50 years,
roughly. Yeah. A very long time.
because because he was Vladimir Lenin's successor. Lenin, there was a attempt on his life. The bullet was in him. They didn't extract it until later on. He had declining health, and I should punch it up here on this computer real quick and look, but it was 1924 when he passed.
He was
And so,
basically incapacitated after 1922, I think, though, right? It
yeah,
was like almost a year or two of incapacitation, where Stalin, really did a lot of work to position himself to be the successor. I was curious, do you think had Lenin lived another 5 years through this revolution, when do you think Stalin would have overthrown him? And do you think Stalin would have done it?
it's interesting. Um, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page now for Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. That was his real last name, was Ulyanov, and it's harder to
Yes.
remember than Lenin. So he made a good choice in his pen name. Lenin just rolls off the lips, and Ulyanov not so much.
When you say his full name, I can only think of literally one movie, The Big Lebowski, where John
Yeah,
Goodman is yelling at Donnie, fucking Donnie, because uh, Jeff Bridges and John Goodman are talking about Vladimir Lenin, and I forget what conversation they're having, but it's a couple guys drinking beer at a bowling alley talking about Lenin casually, and Donnie has kind of not been paying attention. He hears Lennon and keeps quoting John Lennon from the Beatles, and he keeps saying, "I am the walrus. I am the walrus." And John Goodman goes, "Donnie, shut the fuck up. Vladimir Ilyich, he says the full name. He says his
Ulyanov.
Ulyanov Lenin. He says the full name, which is just
Yeah,
hilarious that the Coen brothers would write his full name into it, and John Goodman would be the character that knew that. Anyways, I
yeah.
digress. I just think that's just, when you say his full name, I think of that exact moment in that movie. Um,
He died on the 21st of January 1924, and I think the question that you pose is really interesting because I can imagine a scenario where thereabouts in 1924, that's when the new hostile takeover happens, because this Soviet government wasn't very old by 1924. It was still on shaky legs. They had been doing,
they had
I don't know if it would be,
wrongfully, I mean, what led to, before his alien health happened, he tried to invade Poland. And
yes,
as you said, I mean, Stalin got in trouble with Lenin for the first time because he had followed Lenin everything he said, which is why, I mean, he called him his good little Georgian. Lenin liked Stalin because he was a good administrator. He got the work done. He didn't talk back. He thought exactly like him until he was like, I think Stalin had a good military victory, his first one. He had a battle, won it in Poland. And then Lenin was like, you should take Warsaw. And Stalin was like, oh, because Lenin miscalculated. He thought that Warsaw and Poland was a powder keg, and that they were ripe for the communists to be the communism to spread.
Yeah.
But Lenin was not the psychologist of that Stalin was. He wasn't even close, I would say, just from what I could understand. Stalin understood other peoples very well. He was multifaceted language wise. He was Georgian, so he picked up Russian very well. He
Hmm.
understood the Russian Empire or the periphery better. And he knew that Poles were extremely loyal to their nationality. Before they had Poland had a sense of nationality longer than some other countries necessarily had a sense of nationality to say. And he recognized that, and he knew that economy would not overthrow the sense of nationality that the Poles had for their own country. And so he disobeyed Lenin,
Hmm.
which led to him kind of falling out of favor with Lenin, essentially, when it came to things. So that's why I was like, I
Yeah.
kind of said when instead of if, because I think Stalin, from everything that we've read and know of Stalin since, Stalin would have been the one to do it. He was a
Yeah.
force. He was a tour de force as far, you know. One of the things that I loved the documentary that you sent me and the
Yeah.
three-parter. It was great. And by the way, if you guys haven't, you don't know what we're talking about, we should cue you in. Um, it's this Dictator series that's done by a podcast called Noiser,
Hmm.
a podcast series, and they do a bunch of series on dictators. It's great. Uh, the Stalin one, it kind of sets it up like he was lucky and kind of stumbled into power. They even say it some way like that. And after the three-part documentary, to say that at the beginning made no sense because if anything, he didn't stumble into anything. He was a man of force. It would be like saying Lenin stumbled into power. It made by Lenin's actions, as we saw the rise in the turn of the century through 1905, his positioning in parliament, and then coming back and positioning more people in 1917 through the as the his party, the Bolsheviks, took power. Like that was all Lenin. He was determined, singularly focused on taking over Russia. That was Lenin. And Stalin was singularly focused on getting power. I mean, I would say that was the difference. Maybe Lenin also, it was the same thing, but um, Stalin didn't stumble into anything, and neither did Lenin. They definitely didn't stumble into anything. But um, I do think that Stalin would have overthrown Lenin eventually.
Yeah.
And I
Had
think
his
2024 is a good date. Yeah.
had his health not already been failing? I mean, w- um, Joseph Stalin is the kind of person in history that would see an ailing competitor and wait, because during that time you're waiting for your ailing, sick competitor to eventually die. Which this is the early 20th century in Russia, so health outcomes have a really determining,
Yeah.
or health outcomes are very determined by the technology at the time. Then by 1924, well, by 1922, really, Lenin is hardly a factor. But by 1924, he's gone. And I think that had Vladimir Lenin not been ill and incapacitated following that assassination attempt, I think that there would have had to have been a coup. In this case, it would have had to
Yeah.
have been a coup, and the process of revolution started all over again, where Vladimir Lenin is again. He would have made a great villain to have out there on a string, a nemesis, but he would have been deposed.
Mm. Yeah. I don't know if Stalin would have kept Lenin around. Lenin's scary. I don't know.
Yeah,
Stalin would have respected Lenin too much to, like Trotsky made sense as a villain to keep around. And I
yeah,
mean, and to the point where it was annoying Stalin, right? I mean,
yeah,
Trotsky really annoyed Stalin, even from Mexico. He was writing, tons of pamphlets and anti-Russian manifesto, all that stuff, anti-Soviet manifestos. Trotsky was an interesting fellow, as I've learned about him. So yeah, I think you're right. I think Stalin would have done it then. Um, it was interesting, Lenin's wife and her hatred of Stalin, because she saw Stalin, what he was doing. He was positioning himself. And I thought it was really interesting that Lenin had graded. Um, what was interesting is that Lenin had graded each of the dictators. Um, not sorry, each of the future dictators. No, he had graded the 6 cabinet members that he thought were most likely to succeed him. And he had done this in private. This was some manuscript that his wife had, and his wife knew what Stalin was doing. So when Lenin was on, descending into more and more sickness, he couldn't even speak. Stalin had positioned himself by his bedside and basically dominated Lenin's side and been his translator and everything else, his administrator, pushing his wife out really to the
Mm-hmm.
point so that he could position himself to take the throne. And that's what he was doing. His wife was aware of it and was upset that Stalin was doing this, and released this paper because it had said something like, I forget what it said about Stalin. Um, shit, I forget. Do you remember what he had graded Stalin as? He had said
No.
there was something negative about each person. That was the most
Yeah.
important thing. Oh, he's rude. Um, and he's already amassed too much power. Like he said, he's amassed too much power amongst the administration, and he's rude. Uh, and the wife released this thinking that the people would be like, oh no, to Stalin. But just like MAGA supporters, these people liked that he was rude and that he
Yeah.
was accruing power. They thought that was a good thing. Oh, finally, someone who's accruing power. Screw these guys. They liked that. It's funny to note that Stalin uh, and Mao and Xi, China's current authoritarian leader, uh, amassed power the same way Stalin did. It's important to note that Stalin, while he was rising to power, took tons and tons of boring administrative positions that no one wanted to do. And so he would take these like cabinet leader positions, department of blah, 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 department of this, because he understood that if you controlled the administration and the logistics of the country, you controlled the country. And the real power was
Yes.
in the boring work.
Yep.
Xi, in his rise to power, which we will probably cover in the future, similarly did this within
Mm-hmm.
the CCP before he rose to power. He took tons and tons of different cabinet positions and flushed out opposing party members and put into place people that aligned with him. And Stalin
Mm-hmm.
did the same thing. And he did this to overthrow Trotsky's control over um, the Bolsheviks. And
It's super
yeah,
short-sighted, but it gets you immediate effects.
it's short-sighted, but he maintained power for 40 years. It's short-sighted for the current situation. You're going to basically, yes, it's like it's a band-aid that you're going to have to redo the open the
Yeah.
wound again, right? Basically.
Yeah.
And that is the problem of these power structures. It's essentially like when you build everything off of lies, propaganda, and corruption, it's just
Yeah.
like building on sand. You're always, before you can even ever establish foundations, um,
Mm-hmm.
everything's crumbling around you. And that seems to be the lasting lesson we should get from communism, by the way. It's, we've only seen capitalism actually expand people's individual wealth and freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
um, that's the truth of the last 100 years. If you want the TLDR of what communism was, it was uh, a misdiagnosis of a problem and a mis allocation of a treatment to that problem that didn't really
Yes.
exist. And so if you had a problem that was already taking care of itself through transition over time, capitalism was transitioning and liberalism was growing. And we saw
Mm-hmm.
that, we've seen it. We saw it happen over from the 1850s all the way till now. More and more people under capitalist societies have gotten more and more freedoms. Even within the US over the last century, we've seen freedoms expand to the individual. Now, there's been periods of contraction, don't get me wrong, but
Yeah.
generally, the graph has gone up in general individual freedoms. And maybe certain people's individual freedoms have gone down, but the collective of Americans have gotten and been afforded more and more freedoms. Um,
It's a nonlinear progression, and we have to be ever vigilant to ensure that something isn't um, take. I was going to say taken from us, but basically, we have to be vigilant that something isn't changed that's subtle that we miss, and then that's used in some big takeover later, which is what you and I are calling out with the court rulings from earlier in the summer.
yep. Project 2025, court rulings. And then
Hmm.
finally, we're getting to probably the biggest external threat is the current Cold War that we're in, which is, I think this is a good place. Actually, yeah, we're at the hour right now. So yeah,
Hmm.
just as a reminder of where we're at, we're slowly painting the picture and giving you an idea of where we think the Cold War started. And you can start to see with our talking about Lenin and Marx and talking about communism and why it's important to understand their ideology and what they truly believed. And they truly believed that capitalism was evil and liberalism was evil, frankly.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, we're going to get more into that. I think next episode we'll be talking about Stalin probably a little bit more. I would like to bring in Mao more and China. I think that it's a
Hmm.
good time to start talking about the two biggest powerhouses in the Communist uh, Party,
Hmm.
and because I think that yeah, it'll go in nicely. We can kind of talk about Russia in the 1930s and 40s, but it's a lot of Stalin trying, making a lot of governing mistakes, of course, because he's under the umbrella of
Right.
communism, but and then using methods to stay within power over
Hmm.
time, and that's kind of what it is. There's a couple of things I'd like to highlight about Lenin's treatment of the peasant class. I think is really important. We should probably talk about that next time. Um, uh, yeah,
So at this inflection point, what we have arrived at is the our loose retelling of the foundation of the Soviet Republic, our our loose retelling of the person who was Vladimir Lenin, and um, this the key idea to take away from this is that in 1917 this all came to pass,
yeah,
and and you probably wouldn't find any evidence that the United States was a specific enemy of this new Soviet republic that was coming into existence, but all liberal capitalist entities outside of the Soviet sphere were enemies. They were the problem in the mindset of the people that fomented this revolution and then brought into existence this power.
the Brits specifically were enemy number one of the Russians. No matter
Yeah.
what, they represented they to in the Russian eyes they were the avatar of capitalism, globalism,
Mm-hmm.
and liberalism at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this transition to the U.S., which was the progeny of the
Yeah.
UK, and the U.S. has been a symbol of liberalism, freedom, and capitalism for the whole world. Obviously, that's why so many people
Yeah.
keep trying to move here. Obviously, so the ideology is baked in to communism and Marxism, and we see that transform. And so we're going to talk about how that grows with Stalinism. Really, we could just call it
Mm-hmm.
Stalinism because communism becomes Stalinism. Um, it really becomes about uh, yeah, it's a cult of personality eventually.
Mm-hmm.
As many of these dictators and these authoritarian regimes do become. Um, so
Well, maybe we should wrap this one up for the good of the order,
yeah,
and we'll reconvene next time and talk about the things that came to pass in um, the resolution of the First World War, which was the Second World War.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great place to go, and I can't wait to talk to you next time. All right, Richard.
Right on, man.
Talk to you soon. Take care.
Okay, dude. See you next time.